Chapter 21. Whatever the cost. All die. Those who die for Christ should not be considered neither heroic nor foolish. Dying is a normal part of Christian life. We have one life to live and one death to die. Dick Borgen. We waited a few days before sharing the news with our Turkish community because we knew that they would take it hard. We hated to introduce them to this pain, but we prayed that God would use the coming storm of sorrows to break down the walls that kept them from Jesus. But even with that hope, it was still difficult to deliver news like this to people we loved. Anne told her Turkish sister first, and she wept. She couldn't believe it, but more than that, she was sad that they'd been away when they first found out. "I'm so sorry you had to do this alone," she told Anne. Anne's Turkish sister had lost her brother when he was relatively young, and we knew she would take the news hard because she saw me as her brother. "It's serious. It's in the very late stage, and we don't know how to tell Mom," Anne said, referring to her Turkish mother. "Okay, then we'll tell her together." So the Turkish sister called in our mom, and along with Anne, they talked about the weather and other light-hearted things. Then Anne asked her to sit down. "We have some news. Stan's been sick while you were gone, and we've been to the doctor." Our Turkish mother took it very hard at first, quickly moving to denial. "Maybe it's just a stomach bug," she proclaimed. "No," our Turkish sister told us the matter-of-fact voice, "it's serious." In the days and weeks to follow, the Turkish mother would come to our house and sit on a green stool and stare vacantly out the window. She cried quietly during those times, lonely tears that left narrow trails running down her deep cheeks. She wanted to be with us. She wanted to support us with her presence, but she didn't know how or wanted to cry in front of us. So she looked out the window and watched the seagulls floating on the buildings and the gray winter sky drop down just above where we sat. It was hard to see the devastating emotion my diagnosis brought to our friends. There's a cultural correct way to deliver difficult news in Turkey. In America, we tend to believe it's the best to just rip off the Band-Aid, get it over with, but in Turkey, you introduce bad news in stages. You might take a week to deliver it in various steps. Perhaps you first tell your friends about the stage and symptoms, the pain that you're having, and the questions that you have. Then, in a day or two, you might tell them that you've scheduled a doctor's appointment. A few days later, you might mention that you don't look so good. Then finally, perhaps a week down the road, you might tell them the full diagnosis. But we didn't realize this right away, and Anne told one of our friends in the dark Cannon village a little too suddenly. This woman is such a dear friend. She lives far away, and Anne didn't feel any reason not to share the news with her over the phone. "We took Stan to the doctor," Anne said, "because he's been very sick. Now the doctor told us that he has cancer." At one point, Anne heard grief-stricken shouting from the other side of the phone. "Haradandan, Haradandan." No, no. Anne knew she was broken the news too quickly, but there was no turning back at this point, so she kept moving forward with the details. "Yes, it's been found late. There is no possibility of surgery." She paused, then she continued. "He doesn't have long to live." Anne's friend started sobbing hysterically. Anne didn't know what to do, so she asked if her friend and neighbor was home. The woman needed someone to be with her. The next day, Anne called her again. She started crying right away, but Anne was able to pray with her. The next time they spoke on the phone, Anne's friend shared something that moved us deeply. "My husband went to the mosque to pray for Stan. My family, my sister, my brother, everyone is praying for Stan." Anne sent her text message and continued to encourage her in scripture how God would comfort her in the way that God comforts a child. Anne didn't call because she didn't want to upset her friend, but immediately the phone rang. "I'm nothing," Anne said. "Don't even think of the news right now. Just think of Stan." We had to convince our Turkish friends that despite the challenging of circumstances, life continued, and we were at peace. We put all our energy into comforting them, trying to help them see our faith gives us strength. I hope through the process they have seen the unwavering faith. I hope they've seen Jesus. God, I pray our friends are going to the mosque to pray for me. Thank They're taking this heavy burden and looking for answers. Meet them there. They're calling out to you on my behalf. Show them Jesus. Our doctor sent me to a cancer hospital where they performed a colonoscopy and delivered the cancer, started in my colon before metastasizing into my liver, and then confirmed the diagnosis as stage 4 colon cancer. From there, the first moment I received the diagnosis in Istanbul, so many things were made. The pain I felt in my stomach the years before hadn't even had a bacterial infection at all. It's been the early stages of this disease. The nudging from God to pray differently and have courage. He allowed us to submit our lives completely to Him. In an instant, the doctor showed us the MRI image. We understood. It was like God was saying, we have talked about this. I've asked you several times throughout the year if you were willing, and you always said yes. It's not that God asked me to have cancer. It's that He asked me, what will it take to bring our Muslim friends to Christ? And this was the answer. This is what it's going to take. All along we said yes to God. We're willing, whatever the cost. But in another way, the diagnosis didn't come by a surprise because we thought the cost, the loss, the destruction would come from a rocket-propelling grenade aimed at our truck or kidnapping. We thought the loss might come from a blaze of light and fire. But we were so thankful that didn't happen because in our family had suffered from acts of terrorism. People would have no reason to see how awful those Muslims are. Instead, through the struggle with the cancer, our American friends, we see sincere love poured out into our community and even the mosque community. They heard about the villages who cost daily for updates, who weep for us, who offer to do anything for us. They can. We want our American friends to see the loveliness of Muslim people. During those first few days after the diagnosis, we still felt a sense of shock. But those were also the best days because those were so much grace in the moment. I could feel God's hand leading us along the peaceful way. We have reasoned together, God said. You agreed to do anything that was necessary. This is what's necessary, and I will be with you. So that's why when people ask how to pray, pray for Muslims. Don't pray for healing without first praying that God would save Muslims. We don't want our healing to happen at the expense of the soul. I believe if God healed me right now, even such a miraculous sign couldn't change our community. They've seen healings. They've seen signs and wonders, not yet in people seeking Christ. Yet they see me now, and their hearts are deeply affected. They see a man, a friend, dying of cancer. They see a man that still has hope. He still has joy, and they don't understand how it's possible. Aren't you afraid of death, my friend asked me in one of those rare moments where he couldn't keep his composure long enough to talk about my cancer. Aren't you afraid to talk about death? I'm not afraid, I said. I know where I'm going, and I know who I'm going with. I know that Christ has prepared a home for me. And because I'm sick, they don't argue. So I have a brand new doorway open to where I can be bold and even talk more clearly about Jesus. When we returned from the last expedition, Anne felt like God was giving us Psalm 68 again. She thought she understood why the chapter stood out in her mind. Our trip has been such a huge success. Our enemies had parted before us. Our new ways have opened. But the entire revelation didn't come until we were on our way out of the hospital, the cancer diagnosis fresh in our minds because Psalms 68 said, "A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in the holy dwelling. God sets lonely in family." A father to the fatherless, a defender of the widow, God sets loneliness in families. She realized that she didn't have a window in Psalms. Our friends made the fatherless. God would be with her and the defender. God would be a father to my children. And that hasn't been a single moment of fear, sadness. There's sadness, loss. Sometimes I feel a great sense of loss, but no fear. Not one instance of fear. I'm not looking for has got years. When God told that his life was over, the king turned to the face and walked and begged God to grant him more years. It was Sid the king. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. 2 Kings 18:5. So God gave him 15 more years. During those years, he showed him wealth to the Babylons. When prophet Isaiah told him everything he had shown, as well as some of his sons, he would be taken captive to Babylon. Sadly, Hezekiah thought that it was good. There would be peace and security in my days, he said. A son fathered in those years became a king and did more evil than the nation of the Lord and destroyed more Israelites. 2 Kings 21:9. It makes me wonder what would happen if Hezekiah had accepted God's instructions and put his house in order rather than cry out for more years. That's what we're trying to keep our eyes on here. A few years ago, God asked us to teach a new way to pray for the country because we weren't seeing changes. These were the words: at all costs, shake this nation, break the stronghold. That's the prayer God gave us to pray. He prayed that prayer in the mosque and in the study and while I was walking the streets of Istanbul. After and after, year after year, God continually to give us chances to change that prayer. He would say, not at all cost of our children, not at all cost of 16th wedding anniversary, not at all costs having a home someday where we can write and go for long walks. He could have replied to God's question just with simplicity, but at this point he gave us the courage to simply say, whatever the costs. Even now, this is how I continue to pray. God, I lay down my life, my hope, my dream. I am a sinful man with checkered past. I wasn't always passionate for you, God, but I lay it all down. I lay the sickness down. Do whatever it takes to break the chains of bondage in Turkey. We are your servants. Pour it out on us. The end of chapter 21.